This is lecture 2 from chapter 7, topic 10. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the sources of news media. In this lecture, we're going to look at the sources of news media, both the traditional news media sources as well as the new media or online news sources. And then we're going to think critically about online news consumption. Before we get started, I want you to think about what your sources of news are. What news sources do you rely on the most to get your news? How frequently do you access the news? Every day, multiple times throughout the day, a couple times a week, rarely, if ever. So just think about, where do you get your news from? Do you get your news from newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the local journal Sentinel? Do you rely on television to get your news? And if so, do you watch cable news like Fox News or CNN? Or do you watch a national news show like CBS Evening News? Or do you get your news through a local news channel, such as the nightly news that you have in the Milwaukee area? What about news aggregators? Do you not go to a specific news source like CNN or the New York Times when you're online? But when you get your news, do you go to a news aggregator? Like, do you check Google News to get a summary of like all the stories that are happening in the United States and throughout the world? And what about social media? Do you use social media as a source of news? Is that your primary source of news? Do you follow news journalists on Twitter? Do you follow specific news sites on Twitter? On Facebook, there's a news feed that will give you stories based on particular algorithms. So, to what degree do you follow social news via social media? Or do you not follow the news at all? A lot of people are turned off by the news. We saw in the last lecture that trust in media is relatively low. So it wouldn't be surprising if some people just turn the news media off completely. Well, this is a slide that shows you the changes over time, just in the last couple of years, in terms of what people rely on to get their news. And, as you'll see, and it's probably not surprising because a lot of people are basically sort of cutting the cord when it comes to television. And so they're maybe getting their news sources from other places. But we see that while television is still it's the main source where people get news, there's been in the last 2 years a significant decline in relying on television. Um, on the flip side of that, there's an increase in news websites, and so that's maybe picking up where the decline in television has, maybe they're making up that difference there. Radio has been pretty stable. 25% of people relying on the radio. And probably the biggest, change here is the decline in print newspapers and the increase in social media as a source where people get their news. When we look at news sources, that we see a digital divide. And so this is news sources by age cohorts. You'll see that the burgundy is television, the yellow is news websites, the gray is radio, or the green is radio, the gray is social media, and the blue is print newspapers. And you basically see that the when it comes to relying on news websites, younger people, the age 50 and lower, both news websites and also social media. Look at that in the age group of 29 to 18. Social media plays a huge role in terms of where people get their news. Second is news websites. In the 49 to 30 group, more people rely on news websites, but a significant number rely on social media. And it's not surprising that when it comes to older people, 50 years and older, that they still rely on the television as their main source of information. But older people also rely on print media and print newspaper as well. So you sort of see that that when it comes to the news media, that younger people are much more likely to get their news media online, where older people are more likely to get it in print form or via the television. Maybe think about some of the implications for that digital divide. Your textbook talks about two categories of news media. We have the traditional news media category that includes newspapers, but also includes broadcast news, which encompasses things that use the broadcast waves, the airwaves, to transmit their message. That would be radio, not satellite radio, but just airwave radio, and broadcast television as well. And so those are the categories that fall into traditional media, and we're going to take a look at the benefits and the drawbacks of the traditional media. They also talk about a category called new media, which is just a category that includes all online news media sources. So let's dig in a little bit more deeply and look at each of in more depth traditional news media, and then we'll turn our sights to new media. All right, let's start with newspapers. Now, newspapers, as most of us know, is the oldest method for the dissemination of news, both in the United States and beyond. And your textbook talks about the rise of the penny news press, where there was a period of time in the 19th century, as we see a rise of literacy in the United States. A lot more people can read. Then that's coupled with increases in advancements in technology and the proliferation of cheap newspapers that people could purchase. Um, Today, when we think about newspapers, that it's in the legacy news sources, such as newspapers like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune. So the list goes on. These are papers that have been in circulation for a very long period of time. And so they're sometimes referred to as legacy news sources because they have an established reputation of abiding by the professional standards of journalism, and they, have a reputation for hard-hitting journalism that's fact-based and properly sourced. And so it's in newspapers that you're most likely to find those journalistic standards that are driving the newsroom decisions. You're also, because it's print, that, newspapers, and, you could throw in news magazines here as well. They can really do long form journalism, right? They're not limited by, hey, you have to cram this all into a half hour news broadcast. I mean, you can dedicate many pages to a news story, and sometimes very important news stories will get many pages in the newspaper. And so you'll have in-depth news reporting and analysis that newspapers and other print journalism afford that sort of ability to dig in deeply. Now, as your textbook points out, that print newspapers in particular, have really faced some struggles recently in terms of profitability. As more advertisers turn to online independent advertising, so now we have things like if you're going to purchase a car or you're going to looking for an apartment to rent. Back in the day when I was, growing up, you used to like look at the newspaper to see, hey, is there a job? Hey, is there an apartment I could rent? Hey, I want to buy a car. Where can I find it? People don't turn to the newspapers to find that anymore. You've got Craigslist, you've got Indeed and Monster.com. You have other places that you turn to in order to find jobs and to find things that you want to purchase. And so newspapers have been really struggling in terms of revenue because they've lost a lot of that advertising dollars just as a virtue of increased changes and disruptions within technology. We also see that, because of the rise of new media that we'll see in a little bit, that the print circulation of paper is down. So a lot of traditional papers, legacy news sources that I've listed before, they're really turning to their digital platform and making it so that you can't get the news for free anymore. So if you want to read more than 5 newspaper articles a month, you've got to pay for it. And so that you see that circulation in print is down, but digital subscription is up. Now, do keep in mind that with as newspapers move towards a more digital platform, that there can be barriers to access to that, both financial and internet barriers. If you've got I've always, with students, I know that they can only read 5 newspaper articles a month, and I feel bad asking them to subscribe. And so that kind of access is limited by people's financial resources. It can also be limited to your internet access. If you don't have good and reliable internet access, you're not going, and also hardware to sustain looking at a screen for a long period of time. Sometimes looking at your phone screen, you're not going to read a real in-depth news story. Those are some barriers that we see to this traditional form. Another type of traditional news media is what is known as broadcast news media. That includes television. And so television is still, as we saw from those graphs, the main source of news media for the vast majority of Americans, particularly older Americans. And it really does reach more Americans than any other single news source. Radio is also broadcast news. Radio, there are kind of two kinds of news radio that we have kind of on the airways today. Uh, some news media falls more in the traditional news reporting standards. In particular, something like National Public Radio. Also, in Wisconsin, we have Wisconsin Public Radio. Those are going to be more along the traditional lines of reporting that you would see in a newspaper. On the flip side of that, though, starting in the 1980s, we saw an increase in the radio talk shows, sort of news radio talk shows with Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, even Vice President Pence, had a radio talk show, news radio talk show. A lot of times, these news radio talk shows are maybe more entertainment than they are news reporting. They often rely on a strong personality, a strong perspective, and also call in people who call into that. But it does still fall in the category of broadcast radio news. Both television and radio serve an extremely important function, in particular because when something happens, we want to know about it immediately. We generally turn on the television. And so when you see, for example, when President Trump was diagnosed with COVID, I think a lot of people turned to the newspaper or to the television to sort of see him, the odd, and shocking pictures of him being airlifted from the White House in Air Force Two or Marine One, the helicopter, and taken to Robert Reed or Walter Reed, I'm getting all my names wrong here, for treatment. And so, or if there's a hurricane, if there's some sort of disaster like on 9/11, right, that we turn to the news, television to get that information. However, the downsides of broadcast news is that they're time constraints, so that they can cover relatively few topics, particularly if it's a half-hour news show. Can't not go into as much depth of coverage as we have in the print media, and that there's always rating constraints in terms of the content that you play. You want to make sure that what you're playing is going to draw either a broad audience or specifically partisan audience, and so there can be constraints as it's relating to, hey, how is what we're broadcasting going to impact our ratings? That's with television mostly. Now, new media is a category that's used to refer to online news media. And there's a lot of different kinds of new media that probably a lot of you rely on. Now, as we know, many people, especially under the age of 50, rely heavily on online news. So, again, you sort of see the digital divide there. Older people are much more likely to rely on traditional news. Younger people, much more likely to rely on so called new media. And the impact that can have, both beneficially and detrimentally. Here are just some types of new media that you might consume. We have news aggregators, so any kind of media platform that aggregates the news, that takes news stories from multiple sources and then presents it to the viewer. That's a news aggregator. So Google News, Apple News, those are examples of news aggregator. Sort of Reddit is a good example. It's sort of social media, but it's also a place where people can go and share news stories and aggregate news stories. Real Clear Politics is another good example of aggregating specifically campaign news. There's also niche online news, and niche online news is, and we've really seen an increase in the amount of reporting that's done on in these niche online news sources, And what niche online news sources do is they're targeted towards a particular audience, right? So the news that they're doing is targeting certain segments of the news consuming news. And here's just some examples. So Huffington Post sort of targeting more liberal viewers, Vice younger viewers and sort of more sensational news stories. Bustle is targeted towards younger, sort of progressive women. Drudge Report, mostly conservative, kind of muckraking kind of news. And so all of those are examples of niche online news. And then finally, we have social media, right? Twitter and Facebook are probably the biggest purveyors of news within social media. So I know that I use Twitter. I don't post on Twitter, but I mean I turn to Twitter first in the morning to see like what are the news stories that are bubbling up. I follow news journalists from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, from the Washington Post, just to see what is happening. And you start there, and you can click on a news article, particularly if you subscribe to that, and then you can read your news from there. Facebook, it has sort of a different approach. You can get news stories from the people that you follow on Facebook. But you can also, there's a news feed that will feed you stories, and Twitter has a news feed as well. But I would say that Facebook's news feed is a little bit more aggressive in terms of the news stories that it's feeding to you. All of those fall in the category of new media. So let's look at the benefits of online media. Like, what are the benefits of getting your news or relying on your news, fundamentally or primarily on online media? Well, for one, there's just a tremendous convenience, right? Traditional media, you've got to subscribe to a newspaper. You've got to actually have the newspaper with you to read it. It can be clumsy, difficult. That same with radio and television. You have to be near the hardware in order to get it and sit down for a particular news broadcast. Online media is sort of much more convenient, right? Twitter, you can just see the news stories all in one place. It's easily accessible through your phone and other devices, so there is a great convenience. Another benefit is those who access news media online tend to show a greater interest in politics. So it could be because you are interested in politics, you're more likely to follow it online because you want to be on the forefront of what's breaking. But it could be that if you just happen to be on social media, that you're also getting fed news stories, and those news stories could increase your interest in politics. But those who use online media for accessing their news do seem to show a greater interest in politics. There's a speed, obviously, to online media that even surpasses what goes on television. Television has breaking news, but oftentimes that news breaks even quicker on Twitter and other online media sources. That the online media can provide adaptive information depending on what news source you go to. So a lot of times, you'll be reading an article on the online platform for the New York Times. You actually get more information from that than if you're reading in the hard copy. There are interviews you can watch. There are hyperlinks that you can click on. There's more in depth. You can, it can suggest news stories that you might be interested in after you read a news story on like the prevalence of voting fraud. They can give you other news stories that have been covered on that matter. So depending on what online news sources you are looking at, it can provide you a depth of information and also a diversity of viewpoints. One of the nice things about Twitter and news aggregates is that on Twitter you can follow people from many political perspectives who are in the news media. It gives you a diversity of viewpoints. The news aggregators will give you news stories from many different sources. Again, a diversity of viewpoints or a diversity in terms of the way news stories are framed. Now, that diversity of viewpoints can also lead to misinformation. So there's a lot of media out there in new media, and it's kind of up to the consumer to figure out what is fact based and what is not. And so, because there is such a diversity of voices and viewpoints, it leaves it to the consumer to figure out what is quality, what is reliable, and what is not. And that can sometimes, if you don't make the right assessment, can lead to misinformation. Just as there are many benefits of online media, there are a lot of concerns as well. Probably one of the major concerns is just the quality. That when it comes to online media, that you don't sometimes have the same editorial structure that we talked about when it comes to legacy news sources and journalistic standards. We talked in the previous lecture about how journalists report to editors and editors report to chiefs, editors in chief. And they all do sort of like a checking to make sure that what journalists are publishing live up to a certain standard. That doesn't always or even often happen in online news sources. It can, but there's no assurance of that. And so the quality is a concern. There can also be a concern on online news sources that you're looking for clicks. You want click, 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 because click results in advertising dollars. And so sometimes online news sources will conflate what's really popular and what's really viral with what's important to know about and what's factual to know about. And that can be problematic. Online news media, particularly niche journalism, can look at news through a narrow lens. And so many websites specialize in putting forth a singular point of view, which is fine if you're reading a lot of different like niche journalist sites. But if you're just relying on one, then it's going to really have a potentially detrimental effect on your knowledge. And that leads us to our next concern about online news media, which is the potential effects that online news has on media. And this is something that I try to self monitor on myself, but it's sometimes hard. That you know that you can have a filter bubble, right? So who you put in your news feed and who you put in your Twitter feed, you can self-select that, right? I mean, and that's the self-selection bias. You can say, I'm just going to follow these news journalists or these news sources, and I'm going to filter out the rest, right? Well, that can lead to sort of the echo chamber, so that you only follow news sources that you think conform with what you believe to be true. So what you believe to be true is never challenged because you're just reading people who are confirming what you already believe. And that can lead to misinformation. If who you're following is wrong, then you're going to be wrong. And then that leads to just being an echo chamber of thinking what you're reading is factual, but in fact, it's not. And so, that can have obviously an impact on knowledge. It can also have an impact on tolerance. If all you're reading is people you agree with, then when you're presented with somebody you don't agree with, you don't have the tools to be able to manage disagreement or conflict in a civil manner. There's studies that show that exposure to highly partisan news or news on social media can lead to like lack of political knowledge, right? Because of that information. And so all of these are cause for concern. Okay, so in conclusion, after listening to this lecture and reading the chapter, how might you alter your news media diet? Do you worry about the filter bubble in your own online media consumption? I know that that's something I'm concerned with. We all want to be reinforced in our beliefs, and but it's important to make sure that you have that sort of diversity. So, might you change the way you consume news online, knowing about the filter bubble and the echo chamber? And also, just more generally, what changes would you like to see in order to address some of the concerns that you might have with traditional and online media? If you have some problems with traditional media or online media, what are some of the changes that you would like to be seen for you to have a higher level of confidence as you are consuming that kind of news? Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.